Good and gracious God, we give you thanks and praise for the gift of Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, for the call to each and every one of us to a deeper relationship with Him and an understanding of the gift that we are given in our faith, in the church, in the sacrament. We ask in a particular way that your Holy Spirit may come down upon Lorelei tonight, upon us as well, that we may hear what you desire us to hear, that she speak what you desire us to speak. We ask all this in your name. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Well, good evening. Thank you so much for coming out to hear my story. It is such an honor and a humbling experience to be able to share my journey to the Catholic Church with people, especially because never in a million years was I going to become Catholic. And here I am. So we will take my journey from beginning to end. I have about an hour with you, which isn't a lot of time to tell a journey that spanned a few decades. So I will do my best to be brief and concise with these pieces, but at the end I'll share my website with you, and on that website I've written a lot of articles about each of the individual issues and more that I wrestled through on my way to the Catholic Church. So to begin, I would like to introduce you to my family. This is my husband, John Paul, and our oldest daughter, Felicity. She is going to be 7 in January. August is 4, and Mary is about a year older than that picture now. Her name's Mary Charlotte, and she's almost 2. And it was sort of a funny thing, but we named all of our children after saints, but 2 of them were born before I even cared about what saints were. So we have 4 people named after saints in the family because of John Paul. There is no Saint Lorelei yet, so my kids always joke that I have to become the Saint Lorelei, and it's a lot of pressure, but I'm working towards it. All right. So the beginning of my story actually starts at my baptism. I was baptized in the Catholic Church, but I was not raised in the Catholic Church. My parents did it because it was a thing that my parents did, that the people in the town did. And we didn't really attend church very much until I was about 5 years old. And at that point, we started attending Nazarene church. And that was the church where I really started understanding who Jesus was. I was always drawn to Jesus even before we started attending church. There was the Tom Petty song, Free Falling, and there's a line in there, she loves Jesus and America too. And I always identified with whoever the girl was who loved Jesus in that song, even though I didn't know much about him. I went to church camp, I went to youth group, we had potluck dinners, and I made a decision to let Jesus into my heart, which in the Protestant realm is a moment where you say a prayer asking God for forgiveness, telling Jesus that you believe in him and that you want to let him into your life. And at that point in the church that I was in, that meant that I was saved. And being saved meant that I was assured of heaven and that my faith was valid and that I was going to live as a Christian from the moment of that decision. There was really an emphasis on the moment of conversion being that moment of prayer. So saying, Jesus, forgive me my sins, let me into my heart, or I'll let you into my heart. And that's very different from what I came to understand later, but also really isn't that different, because even though my church focused on the moment of conversion, I had sort of always felt this thread of Jesus in my life. And to me, saying that prayer sort of felt more like a formality of something that I had already been moving towards versus a defining moment in my faith life. And some people have those Saul Paul conversion moments, and those happen all the time. But for me, it really was more fluid. So when I transitioned into the Catholic belief a long, long time later, and how conversion is a lifelong process, that really resonated with me from the very first moment that I was officially considered a Christian. So I continued on. I went to, my parents got divorced when I was 12, 13 years old. I started going to an Assembly of God youth group, and that was very different from my Nazarene experience. Nazarene churches are tend to be fundamentalist, so it was much more constricting, like dancing and alcohol and things like that. And the Assemblies of God church was much more charismatic in the sense that there was a lot of speaking in tongues, and the youth group was amazing for my faith, and I met some friends there that I still really love and care for to this day. Lots of speaking in tongues. They didn't ever pressure me to do it, but many of the people in the church or someone would just shout out in the church and speak in tongues. So that was a little different, but mostly at that point in my life, I thought that the differences between denominations was worship style. I really didn't understand anything about there being any theological differences that made a difference. I thought if you went to this church down the street, you might have more traditional worship. If you liked more contemporary worship, you'd go to this church. And that was really about as far as it went at that time. But I also started developing, and I still, every single time I give this talk, every single time I share my story, I can't recall a single anti-Catholic thing that anyone specifically said to me. But I developed over the course of going to that Nazarene church to going to college some very anti-Catholic tendencies. I thought Catholics were weird about their beliefs in Mary. I didn't understand what all the sitting, standing, and kneeling was about. I thought they were super serious. I thought that they just had to do their own salvation in their own power somehow. I developed a lot of misconceptions about what Catholics believed and was primed to be anti-Catholic in any situation. So, fast forward to college, and I met a very nice young man. He was very cute and very friendly, and his name was JP, which stood for John Paul, because he was named after a saint. His family was incredibly Catholic. And the problem was I was falling for him. So I remember sitting with my mom after I had met him, and I was like, Mom, I met this really cute boy, but he's Catholic, because that gave me pause for some reason. Thankfully, my mom was pretty understanding, and she was like, well, he's nice, you like him? So we continued to date, and we got to a point in our relationship where it was time to meet the family. And so I went to his house for the holidays, or after the holidays. One year we were on winter break, and I met his dad and his siblings, and then we went on a ski trip with some of the aunts and the cousins, and I believe we were at the Coates' house for the ski trip. It was over New Year's, and there were so many of them, and they all have so many similarities. And I remember we did the skiing was so nice, and at the end of the evening, the family gathered for prayer, and Uncle Jeff led the family in some sort of Catholic prayer, and I don't remember what it was, but I remember sitting on the edge and wondering if this was going to be okay or not. And it might have started with an Our Father or something, but then they transitioned into the Hail Marys and the prayers that I didn't know, and the Hail Mary and all the Mary stuff really freaked me out. So while they were all praying, I just quietly excused myself and went upstairs, and I hid in the bathroom and I cried. And it was a very, it was an interesting moment, because I think that now knowing them all, none of them wanted to make me feel uncomfortable that night. But I was coming from a place where I had no context for what these prayers were, or why they were all saying them in such repetitive tones, or why they were saying the same prayer multiple times in a row. And it was so foreign to me that it scared me and it freaked me out. And we had another time with JP's dad, and I knew that there was some interest in people hoping that I would become Catholic, and JP's dad pulled him aside one time and he said, "Hang in there, John Paul, she'll come around." And I overheard him say that, and I thought, no, I won't come around. I am not going to be Catholic. And I was upset that he was so worried about it, because at that point in time, I didn't feel like my faith, the authentic Christian faith that I had, was necessarily being recognized as valid. And I know that wasn't their intent. I know that probably this was the first time that, with this generation of the kids in the family, that someone non-Catholic had potentially been coming in. But it was hard because I felt misunderstood a bit. I felt a bit like my faith has been valid my whole life, and yet here you are telling me maybe that it's not enough, or that it's not all that it could be, or it's not the fullness of it. And that was just really tough. It was tough to hear that, and I didn't have a lot of context for understanding why that would be the case, because I felt like my faith was full and I felt like my faith was valid. One aunt in particular, Aunt Lorraine, who is here tonight, had some wonderful conversations with me that also went very over my head at the time, conversations about why Mary had to be ever virgin and that her womb had to be pure and sinless. And we had these talks, and I would get so worked up because I would just be like, I don't know where this is coming from, especially with the Mary stuff, because where I came from, we don't really talk a lot about Mary unless it's Christmas time. We can do nativity scenes. There's a joke that Protestants like pull out statues at Christmas and then we put them away again for the rest of the year. We have the nativity. And we'd sing Mary Did You Know and like Breath of Heaven, but there just wasn't a lot of focus on Mary and her role. And so a lot of those things just came to be confusing, mostly because I wasn't having any context for it. I didn't have any ties to the roots of any of those beliefs. So they just felt like, even though I know now that they're steeped in all this church history and all these traditions, it felt like it was coming out of left field. Never in a million years would I have thought that Mary had to be sinless. Just didn't come up in my faith life. It had never come up before. So there was just nowhere for me to put that in my schema, really. However, my relationship with John Paul continued to progress, and we got married. We were pretty young. I was 21, he was 22. And interestingly enough, we got married inside the Catholic Church. I was still anti-Catholic at the time, but I even tried RCIA, and I quit partway through because I was like, no, thank you. I wasn't ready for it. But we got married in the Catholic Church. We had a liturgy only. My step-uncle was a priest, and his college that he went to was a Catholic college. So I also sort of felt kind of disconnected from any of the churches I had been with, because I had hopped around a bit at that point in college. I tried different denominations, so I just didn't really feel like I had a church home. So we went with getting married at Old St. Joe's St. Louis College near Green Bay, Wisconsin. And it is not lost on me now, but it was then, that at 21 years old, I had 2 sacraments inside the Catholic Church and wasn't interested in being Catholic. But Lori and I were talking on the way here about how the grace that I feel like those sacraments gave to me helped lead me to where I am today, even though I didn't know what they were at the time and I didn't understand the value of what I had at the time. So in our early marriage, faith was a big sticking point for us. JP was still going to Mass. I was still very interested in not becoming Catholic, so there were many Sundays where I would go with him to Mass and he would come to me join me at my non-denominational church. And we would do 2 services on a Sunday for the first couple years of our marriage. And we would argue sometimes. I don't like disunity. I didn't like the disunity, and it was really grating at me. And so I would try and argue JP around the Catholic faith. I would use all of the misconceptions that I had, and I would throw them at him from time to time and try and convince him that the Catholic Church was wrong and that my point of view was right. And while JP had a very, very long-lasting and long-standing faith in his family, it hadn't gotten to a point in his life yet where he had internalized it for himself and knew the answers to the questions that I was raising. And I think that's a very strong point for faith formation in our families and being able to know why we believe what we believe, because the questions do come up and there are very good answers. And we didn't know that at the time. So at a certain point, about 2 years into our marriage, I found the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And that was a church that I felt like had a lot of the good things that JP enjoyed about Catholicism, and that didn't have a lot of the things that I was uncomfortable with. They didn't have the same stance on Mary. They didn't have, confession. There were just different things that I felt like I was comfortable with. And JP decided that we could do this together and we could go to one church together. We were thinking, within the short future, we wanted to have children. And we didn't want them to see mom and dad going to 2 different churches on a Sunday, because how would we have been able to really explain to them that we worship the same God, but our churches didn't count for each other? We felt like that would be difficult for our marriage, so we started going to the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And JP's family, again, they're super faithful Catholics, and I remember JP being cornered at a holiday party after this happened, and his Uncle Tom and Uncle Jeff pulled him aside, I got beers, and they're just like, so we hear you're a heretic now. And JP like talked to him for a while. It was friendly and it was fun. That's just how the Savaryns are. They're very just like, hey, this is what's up. But we made it through that. JP's cousin is a priest, and I always felt like at family gatherings that he wanted to talk to us, but it was just kind of awkward. I did not understand how big of a deal it was for him to leave the Catholic Church at all. I don't think he understood how big of a deal it was. He didn't officially leave, but to stop attending Mass and stop practicing as a Catholic, I don't think either of us knew what he was leaving at that time. And if he knew what he was leaving, I can 100% bet on the fact that he wouldn't have left it. So we went to the Lutheran Church, and then we ended up going, from there we moved to a new community that was First Christian, and there weren't that many Lutheran churches in this new town we had moved into, so we were in the Protestant realm, and again, I was still kind of like, well, it's not that big of a difference, so we started going to a First Christian church, and we started going to a Baptist church because of another move. And at this point in time, you can see kind of my denomination count, and I had been through enough denominations to know that the differences between the churches that I was attending were not just about worship style, but they ran a lot deeper than that. So we had things like, what's essential? What do we believe? What are these statements of faith about? And I'm going to get into that more in a little bit, but it made me feel so confused to a point that I almost gave up on Christianity, because I wondered, if all of these churches are out here and none of them can agree on what's essential or what we need to believe, how do I know Christianity is even true? And that was a really scary place for me, because I couldn't find my rooting in this. I couldn't reconcile all of these differences and just push them aside and say they didn't matter anymore. So JP and I started living basically as practical atheists for a while. We were attending church, but our faith did not impact our life on a day-to-day basis. I didn't think about praying. I even questioned how much God cared about prayers. And I wanted to search for depth. And I was having a hard time finding it. I had so many friends whose faith, including my own, my faith was sincere for so much of my life. But my faith was also shallow, and I didn't really understand the depth, or if there was depth to it. Most of the churches that we went to had statements of faith that were 1 to 2 pages long. And if you guys can compare that with the catechism, there's a big difference in length on the statement of faith. So I was like, is this all the Christian church is? Is it 1 to 2 pages, a statement of faith? That if this is true, if the God of the universe sent his son and all this stuff happened, there has to be something deeper to it. So was there truth? And if there was truth, was there a fullest form of the Christian faith? Was there a fullest way to practice my already valid Christian faith? And if there was a fullest form, was it out there somewhere that I could find it? So some of my major issues, once we commenced on this search for truth, involved the first one, that's a bunch of gold flecks. The church that we were attending at the time, the final church that we went to before the Catholic Church, was Baptist, and they were very Calvinistic. And for anyone who doesn't know what Calvinism is, there's a lot to it. But two of my biggest questions and sticking points were the idea of predestination. In the Baptist Church, they believe that people are born either predestined for heaven or predestined for hell. And there is no real choice involved, that God has created souls and he already knows where they're going, and there's really nothing that we can do about it. This was one of the big theological differences that stuck out to me, because not every Protestant church believes this at all. It's the Calvinist churches and the ones who follow Calvinist theology. But that gave me some struggle in my heart about the idea of free will and our ability to choose God and our ability to reject God. And can we lose our salvation even? How do we have any active role in it? If people are just condemned to hell from the minute they're born, why do we even evangelize? So I had all these questions, and I was really having a hard time getting answers that felt adequate. And then the other one was the gold analogy. So if you look at the world from a Calvinist point of view, you look at us as humans, created humans, from a viewpoint of total depravity, which means that we are born basically as a pile of dirt or a pile of poop, and that Jesus, in his saving us, covers our sin and our dirt and our nonsense with a white sheet, so that when God sees us, he doesn't see our sin. He sees the white sheet, and we are allowed salvation. And that's very different from the Catholic view. So the Catholic view is that God has created us as gold, as good, that he has made us good in his image. He is good, we are made good, but that sin is the dirt that covers us, or the poo that covers us. And so it mars this image of God that we were created to be. And then through grace and through the sacraments, the dirt can be washed off of us, and we can become that fullest form that God intended us to be. So I found that I didn't align with total depravity as my viewpoint for faith. The next one was social justice. My own personal wrestling and reading the Bible led me to believe that we were called to reach outside of our church doors and reach out to the world and to our community, and to not be sheltered inside of ourselves. I read that faith without works is dead, and that led me to believe that therefore we must do things as Christians that reach outside of our comfort zone and that reach the people who are hurting and lost in the world. And I found that some of the churches that I had experience with were more insular, particularly when, again, we were dealing with the Calvinistic theology of the Baptist church that we were at, that they felt it was the highest priority of the church to serve the local church. And they were very clear and very open about that the church was there first and foremost to serve the local church. And that, yes, it was good to do good works, but that it was not necessary to do good works above and beyond that. And again, I found that my own personal beliefs didn't mesh with that, and I couldn't come to a point where I agreed with that stance on social justice. And then came church history. I started feeling really drawn to church history and understanding what that meant for the Christian faith. I had felt so divorced from church history in my life. I didn't know what the early church looked like. We were in a small group in a Bible study at our church, and I was like, so what did the early church look like? And I asked that to our leader, and everyone's just kind of like, I don't know. And I thought, well, if this is where our church came from, shouldn't we know what the early church looked like? Shouldn't we have ways that we can tell what the early church looks like? I even started looking into Judaism and their traditions and considered having a Seder meal, because I was just starving for a connection to the beginnings and the foundation of our faith. I didn't think that modern Christianity should be an isolated thing detached from the history that came before it. And at this point, as far as staying not Catholic, I was very much in trouble, because church history is a huge part of it. Is the church history is Catholic. It's the Catholic faith. So I was still not knowing it yet, but these little things kept happening. And then the churches that we went to also use this quote a lot. And I think that the heart of this quote is very good, but I also had a hard time with it. It says, in essentials unity, in non-essentials liberty, in all things charity. And it's a wonderful intention. But as I was starting to learn about these differences and the things in my own heart and faith life that couldn't reconcile with the church that we were at, I started asking the question, what is essential? And how do I know what's essential? How do I know what's not essential? I agree with the charity part about being kind and loving, but we can't even agree on what's essential. I've been at churches where baptism is essential, Lutheran church, and I've been at churches where it wasn't. And I've been at churches where we did infant baptism and adult baptism. And are there sacraments? And can you lose your salvation? How do we know? How was I supposed to know? How was I supposed to figure that out on my own? It felt like a lot of pressure. And a lot of my friends at that time, I think, were feeling that. They were digging into stuff and trying to, in essence, sort of figure out your own theology. Because it wasn't set out for you. It depended on the church that you went to and the pastor that led the church during the years that you went there. And it became very confusing. And I also started wondering about once saved, always saved. I know I had said that prayer, but I also knew that my own faith hadn't followed the pattern of someone who made a decision for Christ and was saved. I knew that my own faith was very sincere for a very, very long time. And then I also know that there was a point in my faith where I felt like I said no to God. And I don't know what would have happened if I had died during that period of time, because I had pretty much blocked God out of my life, and I had at times thought, I don't think I believe this. Or if someone who was a stranger would have asked me if I believed in God, I probably would have said no. And so my life, I literally had said no to God, and then I was coming back to him, but my life didn't follow this, I'm saved, and then it's done. It didn't match that for me, and I couldn't imagine that God would send someone kicking and screaming into heaven who said, no, I don't want you. So that was really difficult for me, and it was really, really a low point for me when I got to that, because I had been leading worship for a really long time at the churches that I had been at. We had a very well-rounded worship team. It was a full band. We had like cordless mics. We had in-ear monitors. It was really well-done music. And I know that I had been leading worship sometimes during this doubt, and I was too scared to tell anybody that I was questioning all these things. And I looked like I was worshiping, and I sounded like I was worshiping, and I had the hands in the air and my eyes closed, and I was leading a whole congregation in worship. But my heart was very, very far from God. And so it always kind of brings me back to that during masses, like the mass that we had today, where there's no music and we're saying the words, and maybe it sounds rote, maybe it sounds boring. But I've been someone who sounded excited and sounded into my faith, and my heart was far from God. And I've been someone who sounds very rote during mass, and my heart has been closer to God. So I no longer judge people by how they look or sound during worship, because I can't, because I've been fake on the extreme end of the spectrum, where you would look at me and you would have thought I was actively worshiping God. So that brings me to Deacon Jeff, and he passed away in July of a couple years back. And I want to kind of give you my timeline after the tragedy happened, and he left us very suddenly. JP's family, I felt like had come to respect my faith, and I appreciated that. Our conversations were a lot warmer, and it was a lot easier when I saw them, because I felt like they understood that I was a valid Christian. There was one time Lorraine even said that she was working on a pro-life committee with like a Lutheran pastor, and she was so excited about it because it was interdenominational, and I felt like that was such a nice way to reach out. But I had all this swirling frustration inside me, to the point that I wasn't sure I was going to land still a Christian. I was frustrated at apathy, lack of depth, disunity, disagreement about the essentials, lack of connection to church history. And then there was a night early in December. It was cold. Everyone had gone to bed, and I was sitting on the couch. And all these things are just swirling around in my mind. And I had to admit to myself, I thought, oh dear, I think I'm thinking about all these theological things like a Catholic. And we went on a date the following night. JP and I went on a date, and we were sitting at dinner, and I said, JP, what would you think about going to Mass on Sunday? And I don't know, he was not seeing that one coming, but because it had always been something we had thought about. But unknown to me, my husband also, over the past several months, had been feeling drawn to return to the Catholic Church. He didn't want to tell me, because usually that ended up not going well. But he had started reading Catholic theologians on his train ride from work. He'd been doing a postdoc, and they had a great library with a lot of theology in it. And he was feeling like he wanted to go home. And so this came totally out of the blue for him, but we were both on these parallel journeys. And I think the big connection here is that Deacon Jeff passed away in July, and we were enrolled in RCIA by December of that year. And so I think it would be stupid of me not to thank him for his intercession for me, because that timing is just too close, and the path that we took just accelerated so much. And I'm so thankful for that, and I know that many here miss him too. And I wish he could have seen it happen here, but I think he had a very active role in it. So that said, we entered into RCIA, and I'm a very logical person, so I started looking at all those misconceptions that I had about the Catholic Church, and I started tackling them one by one. I thought, well, if Christianity is true, and if it's, if the fullest form of Christianity is in the Catholic Church, then I'm just going to ask all the questions that I have, because if they don't have the answers, I'm not quite sure that there's going to be anyone who does. So the first issue that I came up against was the issue of authority. This was hard for me. There's Jesus giving Peter the keys, and JP's family is German, and they had an Oma, and she would be like, she'd just pull me aside randomly at these family gatherings and just say, and he said to Peter, on this rock I build my church. And I'm like, I have no idea what that means, but apparently it was supposed to mean I was supposed to become Catholic. Okay, so on this rock I build my church. And I have since listened to many talks, and Scott Hahn does a really great breakdown of that Bible verse and why it means he's talking about Peter. But the idea of authority. So the Bible, in some ways, is amazing because even a child can understand many parts of it. But it's also incredibly layered and complex and deep, to the point that I'm quite sure in my lifetime I will never understand all of it, nor maybe any human on earth, because of how complex and layered it is. In addition to that, we have things like Jewish culture and history, and our Catholic faith is so tied into Jewish culture and history, another thing that I know nothing about, and many of the things in the Bible and in our faith stem from that and are rooted in that. In addition to that, the Bible has many different kinds of literary forms. There is poetry, and there is history, and there is allegory, and there is factual recounting of events. And how do you figure out which one's meant to be what? And then thinking also about the culture at the time it was written and the author's intent, and all of these things. And I thought about how I had approached my own reading of Scripture in my life. And I had often been taught that you could just pull a Bible verse out and just apply it to whatever situation you felt like it applied to. And there was not necessarily an emphasis on finding the context for the verse or looking at the culture or the history. It was just like, hey, we'll use this verse and we'll use it to think what we want out of it instead of cross-checking it against the rest of Scripture. And I found that I wasn't comfortable approaching the Bible that way anymore. I wanted there to be cross-checking. I wanted whatever I read, I wanted to understand it in the context that it was meant to be understood, and the culture that it was meant to be understood, and then how it applies to our life today. And the kicker for me was the idea that God had given us this infallible book. Protestants and Catholics, we all agree the Bible's infallible. But did he give us only broken and fallible means to interpret it? Did he give us this book and leave us completely on our own to figure out what he meant by the words in the book? Were we meant to carry the weight of interpretation solely on our shoulders? In 1 Timothy 3:15, it says, "This is the church of the living God, which is the pillar and foundation of truth." So if the church of the living God is the pillar and foundation of truth, I thought that I had better figure out what that means when they say the word church. What does church mean? Because I need to be there. If that's where the truth about this is held, I need to go there. In addition, we all, even my life as a Protestant, I assented to Catholic authority on certain things without knowing it. I assented to Catholic authority on the idea of the Trinity, because the Trinity isn't in the Bible anywhere in those terms. So I assented to that. I assented to Catholic authority on accepting the books that were in the Bible, although we were missing a few in the Protestant realm. I thought you guys had added books, so you had extras. But I learned the history of it, and I actually learned that books were taken out at a certain point, so we took them away. And then I also assented to the Catholic Church in the creeds of our faith that we say at Mass, and that several Catholic denominations say in one form or another during their church services. And I thought, if I trusted church authority in those things, when did it stop being the authority that it once was? Because that would be important to know. And if I couldn't find that point in time where the church stopped being the authority, then maybe it still was the authority. Confession. Confession was so scary for me. My view of confession was that I could talk to Jesus about my sins and ask him to forgive me, and it was done. It could just be done in private. Some of the churches that I went to had a moment of silent reflection. of our sins within the service itself. The amount of time for reflection was usually pretty short, though, and what I found was that I actually didn't spend a lot of time thinking about my sin. Most of the time during that silent reflection during church, and they were like, let's think about the ways we've offended God, I'd be like, I think I'm doing pretty good. Because I didn't really know what I was supposed to measure up to or what standard I was holding myself up to. And I was like, I think compared to most people, I'm fine. But it wasn't really, it was a very obviously subjective way to approach my own sin. And when I came into the Catholic Church, there's kind of a bad reputation of Catholic guilt, like that's like a joke, a punchline, no, Catholic guilt, haha. And in some ways I kind of get that there can be an unhealthy attitude towards sin, but for me, I had an unhealthy attitude towards sin in the fact that I didn't ever think about it. So like you have one end of the spectrum, maybe you think about it too much, and on the other end, like I wasn't thinking about it at all. And when I think about sin now, I think about sin is like if I am facing God and I am with God, and God and I, we're in union and good relationship. Sin is any time that I say, no, God, in this, I'm going to turn away from you and I'm going to do my own thing. And it can be a little turn. It can be a huge turn. It can be such a big turn that I turn my back on God entirely and tell him I sever our relationship. But there's these different ways that sin can go, and if you build up and you say, no, God, I'm going to do it my way, I'm going to do it my way, I'm going to do it my way, and we keep turning away from God, that's very damaging on the health of our soul and on the health of our faith. And so when I started viewing sin that way, it made a lot more sense that we would want to have some sort of a tool to help us turn ourselves back to God and say, no, God, I'm not going to do it my way. I'm going to do it your way, and I'm going to trust you, and I repent, and I want to restore my relationship back with you, and I'm sorry. And that's where confession turned from scary to beautiful for me. My first confession was wonderful and so filled with grace, and it was so nice. It wasn't like I was just like, and I did this, and I did this, and I did this. It was just a beautiful conversation about the ways that my heart had hardened towards or had turned away from God, and it was about my desire to say yes to God from that point forward. And it was amazing, and every time I go to confession, I'm so thankful for it, because one of the great things about the sacraments is we are these spiritual beings. We have these physical bodies. We are both body and we are spirit, and God knows that. And he gave us the sacraments as these tangible physical ways to meet the needs of our physical bodies so we can understand his grace in the ways that our bodies get it. So instead of me praying to God in my room for his forgiveness, I can go to the confessional and I can audibly hear that I'm forgiven. There is such power in that. The priest is acting in the person of Jesus in the confessional and is speaking the words of Jesus to me that I'm forgiven. And there's something so beautiful and so powerful about actually hearing it after having gone a lifetime of saying it and having silence come back at me. Even though in my heart I believed it, there's something different about hearing that I'm forgiven. Mary was another one that was really difficult for me. I had a lot of misconceptions about Mary. I thought that you all worshipped her, for one. I didn't get the Hail Mary, why you prayed to her, why you prayed to saints in general. And I just thought there was an overemphasis on Mary overall. But as I went to RCA and I started learning how the Catholic Church actually views Mary, some things were very helpful to me. The idea that she was sinless always hung me up. And it was very interesting that actually a Bible verse sort of helped me through this. In the Bible, Mary is described as full of grace. What does it mean to be full of grace? If we are full of grace, like if our cup is full of grace, is there room for any sin in it? It's full of grace. There's not room for anything else in it. And that really helped me understand her set-apart role, along with the idea that she is the new Eve. That in Genesis we have this story of mankind falling and a woman making a choice to turn away from God and choose sin. And in the New Testament, we have a story of a woman who chose to turn straight to God and to give the yes that changed the world. And the parallels between the first Eve and the new Eve, and helping to understand that sinlessness, that grace that was applied to her prior to her even being born, was part of fulfilling that greater story that started at the beginning of creation. Also, the idea of the Queen Mother and praying to saints, all of this kind of wrapped itself up inside of me. As a Protestant, when we talk about prayer, there was sort of a sense of worship attached to it, which is why I got squirmy when people said, I'm praying to a saint, because to me, prayer was tied in with worship, which was only for God. I came to understand that when Catholics say I'm praying to a saint, that they're saying they're really asking for the saint to pray for them because they're in heaven and they don't have to pay bills or make dinner or watch the kids or go to work, and they can intercede for us and they can pray for us. Just like I could ask anyone in this room to pray for me, why wouldn't we take advantage of asking all of those who are already with God to pray for us while we're still here and we still face the temptations and the struggles and the trials of living on earth? And so that helped me a lot. And then the idea of the Queen Mother helped me a lot too. In Jewish history, if you had a king and he had a mother who was living, she was known as the Queen Mother, and she had a very important role in the kingdom. And the king would listen to her. If the Queen Mother had something to say, she would have the king's ear. And that helped me too when I thought about us using the Hail Mary or whatever prayer we say to ask Mary to pray for us, because she is the Queen Mother. She is Jesus' mother, and we know from the cultural reference that that means that she has a very extra special role in relation to her son. So the next one is purgatory. And I also had a lot of misconceptions about this. I thought purgatory was like sitting at the airport for eons, or being stuck on the bus on a never-ending loop. I didn't understand the point of it. I thought just souls were just chilling till God thought it was okay for them to come in. I didn't get it. I didn't understand why Catholics had purgatory, because it was when you die, you either go to heaven or hell, and that's it. My view on this started to change to the Catholic view during RCIA, and I started coming to understand the idea that, so we have, saints. We have saints who we admire, and then we have, us who are striving to become saints. But the fact of the matter is that when we pass away, when we die, we're not all going to die at the same point in sanctification. So some of us, our time may come, and we may not be 100% turning to face God. We might still have some of the things that we hang on to, that we say, no, I'm going to do it my way. You can die a saint. You can die ready to go. You could die a Christian, but still clinging on to a lot of that dirt and a lot of that sin that you struggled with. I also came to hold that idea up against the idea of the fact that there is no sin in heaven. In heaven, love is unified and perfect, and we aren't going to be in heaven with sin hanging on to us any longer. So if we do die at a point where we're still clinging on to doing some things our own way, what happens to the sin that we haven't let go of yet? Where does it go? Does it just poof away, or what? And so then the further process in that led me to think about, well, what happens when I turn away from sin on earth, or anyone turns away from sin on earth? It's painful. It's a bit painful, right? Like choosing to exercise, it kind of hurts, or eating right. If I don't eat 3 brownies and I only eat 1, that's in some way it's painful because I love chocolate. But, if you think about someone who's depending on alcohol, going through withdrawal and becoming healthy in that way is painful. Saying I'm sorry to somebody is sometimes painful. Choosing humility when you want to lash out at somebody is painful. So the idea of purgatory sometimes being painful made sense to me in the light of that it does hurt sometimes, actually a lot of the time, when we let go of ourselves and we say yes to God. We have to let go of those things, and letting go of those things isn't always fun. C.S. Lewis, who is well respected in both Protestant and Catholic sides of theology, he was interested in the idea of purgatory. He didn't want God to let him into heaven with sin still clinging onto him. He didn't think that made a lot of sense. So the idea of purgatory shifted in my mind, and I understood its point, and understood what that meant for me in my journey to God, is that yes, I will be in heaven, but I still have some things that I need to say yes to God to, and I need to let go of as far as my own sin. We can all hope to pass away as saints and go straight through, but for those of us who don't, all hope is not lost. And then the Eucharist. So as a Protestant, Eucharist was not the Eucharist. It was symbolic. It was a symbol representing what Jesus did. It was a symbol of his body, and it was a symbol of his blood. My children actually got a children's Bible from the church that we were at, and in the scene of the Last Supper, they actually changed the words, and it said, "This is like my body, and this is like my blood," which I thought was very interesting once we became Catholic, because that's not the words in the Bible. It says, "This is my body, and this is my blood." But I didn't catch it at the time. Wasn't even on my radar. Wasn't a big issue. But once we became Lutheran, I was more drawn to the idea of communion as a reverential act, and of communion as more than just a symbol. Because in the Lutheran Church, they don't have quite the same view as the Catholic Church does, but it's much closer. There is a belief in the presence being truly there. It's not to the same extent and not exactly the same, but there was an additional reverence there, and there was care, and there was, I don't know, it was closer to the Catholic procedures around it and all of those things. And I remember being drawn to it, and I liked the reverence, and something in me, I liked looking at that little cup of grape juice or wine or whatever it was, and I liked imagining it as Jesus' blood shed for me, and it made me so thankful. And then when I ran into John 6, that was also a huge moment, because that's the bread of life discourse, and Jesus says to eat my body, and the disciples and all the people that were around him, everyone was freaked out at that, and Jesus could have been like, "No, guys, I was just kidding, I didn't mean that." But he didn't say that. He insisted, and people left. They left him for it. And so I was coming from a background where we interpreted a lot of the Bible literally. So there was very little symbolism in the background of my Christian faith. It was like the Bible means what it says, and it's all to be taken literally. But nobody ever talked about John 6. No one ever talked about it. No one talked about what it meant. And once I got to that point, even though I know now, some of the Bible's poetry and stuff, like this was the Gospels, like this really happened. This was meant to be a factual, like recounting of an event, and Jesus was talking about himself like the Catholic Church talks about the Eucharist. So in RCIA, we met on Thursday nights, and that was the same night that my parish did Eucharistic adoration. So I'd walk past the sanctuary, and I could see through the glass windows into the host was displayed, and I'd go to my class, but I'd be staring at this window, and there was just a certain point that it changed in me, and this wasn't a huge struggle. Something just changed, and I looked in that room, and I wanted in that room, and I knew something very important was happening in that space, and there was really going to be no going back for me on that at that point. It was something internally that changed in me, and I knew that that was real, and that this was the place that had it, and if this was the place that had it, then I was going to be here. So we had to come to a decision. I think there's one more slide maybe after that. Okay, it's black, yeah. I think it should be, because it was very difficult to tell some people in our lives that we were going to become Catholic. Told JP's family, they all just were jumping for joy, because they had been praying for this for 10 years, and his sister was like, "Are you really in RCIA?" And everyone was very excited, so that was good. But the church that we were at was very anti-Catholic, as you could probably assume based on some of the ways that they believe that are very different. And we had some friends who didn't take it well, and we had hoped that they would, but we were in a Bible study and a life group. At that time, it was a small group. We met weekly. We were told not to return. We didn't get a chance to say goodbye or transition out or anything. We were told it would be best for us not to come, because they thought that we would possibly pollute the beliefs of the newer Christians in the group. We also had a ministry that I was a part of that the church had supported and helped provide some of the needed things for. And within days of us telling the church that we were becoming Catholic, the team who made the decisions unanimously voted to pull support of that ministry, even though I was the only Catholic person on it, and it was a multi-denominational ministry. Their There were pastors that sat in our house and told us that we were not Christians because we were becoming Catholic, and with the Calvinist theology, that meant that they believed that we never were Christians because you can't lose your salvation once you authentically have it. So it was basically disvaluing an entire lifetime of my pursuit of faith and of God, and it was really hard to have those talks, but I'm glad that we did. And I think that the doors that closed for us then weren't closed on our part. We wanted to keep them open, but we stopped getting invited to things, and people stopped reaching out to us to hang out and stuff. And so it was lonely, and it was tough. And I used to cry when I told this part of my story, but I don't anymore because we're a little bit further past it now. And we did get connected in our new Catholic parish, but it did take some significant time. I think that the churches that I went to were really good about making people feel welcome and helping them get connected. And I think sometimes in the Catholic Church it can be a little bit of a longer and slower process. And none of that is meant to be judging, but it is meant to say, if you see someone that you don't recognize at Mass, to make sure that you reach out and say hello to them, because if it's someone like me, I was so excited whenever anyone went out of their way to try and connect with me, and it meant the world. There were also many awkward conversations where I felt like maybe I had turned into the Aunt Lorraine in the situation. Where I was trying to tell my friends, but we have this book, and how do we know how to interpret it? And are we all supposed to interpret it on our own? And I felt like they probably were like, whoa, back off. And it came from a place, and that's how I also came to understand kind of where they were coming from, because it came from a place of passion. But the conversations were kind of awkward because people, again, if you don't have context for any of this and you aren't asking the questions, the answers sometimes, it's hard to have the answers make sense. So yes, we have the sacraments here, we have the Eucharist, but make sure that you are welcoming to those who might be new or visiting the parish. That's always and forever going to be my plug, because it means so much to meet some Catholics too, especially if you're new coming into the church. You can meet some fellow Catholics who aren't at odds with you like that. That's just gold. So I don't have a slide for this one, but I believe it was in the program for the night. My confirmation, it only made sense given the decade plus of praying for me and all the conversations that we had to ask Aunt Lorraine to be my confirmation sponsor. So she went from scaring me and making me cry to standing beside me on Easter Vigil. And I also felt too that it was really appropriate because of Jeff's role in JP returning to the church and my converting to the church. Even though our RCA teacher joked that I was already Catholic because I had a Catholic baptism, I was like, and yet no. But I was like, yeah, I guess, yeah, I sort of am Catholic. So on my confirmation day, I had Lorraine with me. The Savaryns showed up to that Easter Vigil Mass. It was at the cathedral in St. Paul. So many Savaryns were there. And it was one of the most defining moments in my life. I felt connected to the history of my Christian faith for the first time in my entire faith. I felt connected to truth, not what I thought was true or what I interpreted to be true, but truth that's passed down through apostolic succession and solid interpretation that could be cross-checked and had been cross-checked by some of the best minds and the best people of faith over the past thousands of years. I felt connected to depth for the very same reason. I felt connected to the church Jesus founded, that he handed the keys to Peter, and then Peter passed them on. And it's been passed on and passed on and passed on until today. And so all of those things kind of came together for me at my confirmation. So I'd like to take the last few minutes to talk about some of my life after being Catholic. I'm coming up on 2.5 years since my confirmation. So the first thing, we can keep going past that one, that's me and JP. The idea of theology of the body and natural family planning and understanding the purpose of the sacramental marriage that we had entered into. And if anyone is unfamiliar with the work of St. John Paul II, it changed our marriage so good. It is It's a very large work, so many people have made layperson versions of it. Theology of the Body for Beginners is very accessible, and there are others as well. But it has to do with the fact that to love someone truly, and we use the word love in our world so many different ways, and people throw it around so freely, and we use it in all these different contexts. But according to the Catholic Church, to love is to will the good of another. So if I'm loving somebody, I am willing their good. And that is love. And so that the idea of that in our marriage and working on selflessness in our marriage has been transformative. And you literally can go to like week-long seminars on theology of the body, so I cannot get into it all right now, but it's really worth looking into. But in addition to that, we started looking at being gift to each other and living our life as gift to each other and embracing natural family planning. And a month after my confirmation, I'll give you just a little backstory. I get very ill when I'm pregnant. I get something called hyperemesis gravidarum. It's very not great condition. I get very sick for quite a while, but I didn't want to not have more kids out of fear. And there was a really big moment for me where I thought, I think I want to be open to life again. It's a little scary, but through a lot of prayer, that fear went away. And 1 month after my confirmation, found out that we were expecting our third. And that is the babe that you saw in the picture, Mary Charlotte. I named her after Mary, who I now am not afraid of. And my grandmother was also named Mary, but they were a Catholic family, so it all kind of has the same root. And she is just a joy, and I couldn't imagine not having her, and I'm so thankful for that change of heart. She's just a zesty little troublemaker, and she adds a lot of humor and life and fun to our days. And then also the way we raise our kids has changed. I love so much I'm gone all out Catholic. I had to get a bunch of Catholic swag after my confirmation. So we have a holy water font in our home now. So we're all spraying each other with holy water and remember your baptism on our way out the door, and praying together and teaching them the prayers and making sure that they have that. And we also pray just from our hearts too. But I think that combination is wonderful. We love going to Mass together, even when someone freaks out. I was telling Lorraine, Mary, she kneels now by the altar, and I know she's or by the pew, but she's copying us, but it's cute because she's internalizing some of the things that we do. And the best part about it is I know when they start asking tough questions that I'll be able to share with them the depth and the truth of the faith that we have. And it's our goal as parents to make sure that we're living our faith out so that our kids see it and they know it. And I think living as if anyone is a parent in this room, and we can live our faith out for our kids so they can see it being an active part of our life, that is going to be helpful. I think that as adults, I came into this all as an adult. I think if we can learn our faith better as adults, we will be able to help our families and our parish more. And I don't know for sure what will happen with them when they get older, but I pray that they will know the gift that they have in the Catholic Church, and that it will be a part of their life when they are done in my home. This is the website I mentioned at the beginning. It's thiscatholicfamily.com, and it has on it some of my conversion process. It has articles under Catholic 101, just of some of the things that I wrestled through. And it has just some other stuff about our life and the things going on in our life. If you hit the follow button on there, you'll get an email whenever I post. I don't post crazy often, but hopefully it can be a good resource for understanding the Protestant perspective. I think something about being someone who comes into the faith is that I can kind of speak both languages. Sometimes, with the word prayer, Protestants might use a word and Catholics might use the word, but we might not mean exactly the same thing, or communication can be kind of lost in translation, and we might not actually be talking about the same thing, and that's where some miscommunication and frustration can arise. So I really try hard to explain it in a way that sort of bridges that gap. And then I have a couple personal notes I'd like to end with. So this is a picture of me and JP, and on the right there is my Aunt Janine, and she is another reason why I'm really thankful for the Catholic faith. Unfortunately, in February of this year, my aunt, in a moment of great sadness, took her own life. And We miss her greatly. She was 47 years old. But where I was before, her story, like in the Protestant church, her story would have been finished. She would be somewhere and her fate would have been decided. I am so thankful for the grace of the Catholic Church in helping us through this loss. I am thankful that God works outside of time and that my prayers can still help her. I am thankful for purgatory because my prayers can still help her. And I can still love my aunt and I can still will her good while I'm here. By praying for her, I am taking care of her affairs and working to move through the pain. But the prayer is really the huge one because I didn't have that option before, and I can pray for her soul and I can still help her. And that's just huge to me, especially in light of the way that we lost her. And then the last slide, this is on a happier note. So you'll see a lady there next to me. That's my mother. Her name's Linda. She is a really cool lady. And shortly after JP made it back and I got confirmed, that my stepdad and my mom started looking into the Catholic faith and attending RCIA. So this is Easter Vigil on this year, and I'm standing behind my mother as her confirmation sponsor, which was just a joy and a pleasure, and I'm so thankful for that. So they are both, they both made their way home as well. And I think, yeah, so that is the end of my brief, long story. And I am so thankful again for your time and for listening to it. And I'd love to chat with anyone. I know we have adoration, which I'm so excited for, but thank you so much for your time.